I do actually, but.
Then I will nominate members Sylvia Munoz Schnapp.
Second.
Are there any other nominations? Nominations are now closed. Chair Schnapp, you are the new chair.
Okay, thank you. And so then we will go on to the nominations for vice chair. And so are there any nominations for vice chair from this group?
Is there a tradition where the vice chair goes to somebody from the district?
Right,
Okay.
we swap out each
Okay.
year. So, yeah, so it should be somebody from the district.
Anyone from the district interested?
If Director Marcus was here, who is the regular member, I would defer to her, but without sharing too much, I don't know, it may be too much on her plate right now with some things that are going on. So if y'all are okay, I would be willing to do that.
Okay. So is there a second?
Second.
Okay. And so are there any other nominations? All right, so then could we say by acclamation then? So you are vice chair, congratulations. Yeah. So normally then, should we swap out the chairs? The physical chairs?
If you want, or I hopefully have nameplates for everybody next week.
Would that be okay, just to move next time we meet? Okay, super, all right. So we move on then. We have public comment on so let's see. Let me make sure because I have two agendas here. So we did the reorganization. So we have public comment. Do we need to approve the agenda though?
That's your process and I forgot to put it on.
Okay, thank you. So we have the agenda before us. Are there any changes? Is there a motion to approve?
Motion to approve?
Second.
Okay, all those in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Noes? All right. Motion has it, and it's unanimous, so we move on with the agenda. We come down to public comment. So we will have comment from any members in the audience, and seeing that there isn't any besides staff here, we'll move on to closed session item, conference with property negotiators. Mr. City Attorney.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The board will adjourn from open session to closed session to discuss one item this evening. It's conference with property negotiators under the authority of Government Code Section 5495 6.8. The property is described as 5751 Perkins Road, Oxnard, California 93035. Agency negotiators are Rod Butler, Agency Executive Director, and Akbar Ali Khan, Agency Assistant Executive Director. And negotiating parties are the Port Hueneme Water Agency and the City of Oxnard under negotiation, price and terms of payments/purchase.
Okay.
And, the board will be required to reconvene in public session after the closed session and to announce whether or not there are any reportable actions under the Brown Act.
Okay. So we will then excuse ourselves into closed session and then return and go through the rest of the business items and consent agenda. All right? Thank you.
Was it? No, I don't remember that.
Okay. I have witnesses. I can ask for.
Oh, okay. You've got a witness. It must be true, because we know eyewitnesses.
climate is?
Yeah.
Do you know who from Oxnard sits on that?
I told them the statute of limitations applied and they could only get 3 years of the 12 years.
Yes, now I. Right. So at this point, we are reconvening then the Port Hueneme Water Agency here at 4:53. And Mr. City Attorney, do you have any announcements?
Madam Chair and members of the board, there are no reportable actions from this afternoon's closed session.
All right, thank you. So then we move on to consent agenda. Does any member want to pull any of these items for discussion? Or if not, is there a motion to approve the consent?
I have a motion to approve consent agenda.
Is there a second?
Second?
Okay, all those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? None?
May we make a note for the record that there was an addendum to the consent agenda, which was, I believe, received by the board members.
So I make a motion to approve the consent agenda with the addendum.
Okay.
Clarify the addendum?
I believe that's for the city council meeting
I was just
tonight.
going to say, yeah, was
Yeah,
that,
it's the-
okay.
Yeah, definitely.
That's okay.
Never
I'm
mind.
thinking, I don't see one of
No, we were
those,
hiding
but,
it from you guys.
okay,
Yeah.
never mind. So,
I don't read it much above the
I
third grade
withdraw that,
level,
I
so.
withdraw my last motion.
all right. So consent agenda is moved then unanimously. And then now we are on business items, and that's item number 4, Brackish Water Reclamation Demonstration Facility, operational report. Mr. Villafana?
Good afternoon. Right, this is going to be brief. We didn't have meetings before, so this is kind of a synopsis of the last 3 months. In November, we used 3.1 million gallons per day, and that was a little less than October, where we used 3.4 million gallons. We also, in the month of November, we were using the plant. We were in membrane mode for only 5 days in November. Then in December, we used less water again. We used 2.7 million gallons per day. Demand was down, and the plant was in operation for 10 days in December. Now in January, this last month, we again used less water. We used 2.7 million gallons per day, which those 2 months are under what we, if you extrapolate for a full year, we're under what we're allocated, which is good. And however, in the month of January, we did not operate the plant in membrane mode. United Water had issues. There was a breakage. There was some issues with analyzer, so we were unable to operate the plant for the month of January. We have, so that's where we are as of the end of January. So if there's any questions.
All right, thank you. Are there any questions from the board?
I just like, is the plant up and running now?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
Any further questions? All right, so thank you, Mr. Villafana. And then we move on to the update on groundwater sustainability plan development. And Ms. Strockbar? Yeah.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is an item that has come before the board from time and time again, and we'll likely see it another time. We're going to update the board periodically as new drafts of the groundwater allocation ordinance come out. We're expecting to see another one next week that's going to be brought before the Fox Canyon GMA on the 27th of February. So as a bit of background, particularly for our new board members, the Fox Canyon Groundwater Management Agency, they oversee the basin which we receive our groundwater from. They're developing a new allocation ordinance to govern groundwater usage in the Oxnard-Pleasant Valley Basin. And so us as staff have been involved in the municipal and industrial, that's M&I group discussions over the past couple of years. And we stated what we wanted to include in the eventual ordinance via a white paper on behalf of all the M&I participants in May of 2018. So today we've been tracking 3 issues, and we brought this up to the board periodically. The first one is the allocation holder of record, and that is who actually owns the allocation that's assigned to PHWA and its respective member agencies. And number 2, the base period that's been used to carve up the M&I share of the basin. And I say M&I share of the basin, that's kind of an outdated term. If you recall, we used to have this split between the agricultural users of 60% versus the M&I users of 40%. That has long gone away, where there used to be this 2-pool approach. Yes, we are at a 60-40 split, but those 2 pools aren't distinct. It's really a 60-40 split over the entire basin, and I'm going to get into details on the base period in a minute. The third item we were tracking was the Conejo Creek, otherwise called the M&I Supplemental Water Program. That is no longer an issue that we are tracking because the GMA has decided to not include it in the latest draft ordinance. So that's good news for us. However, the first 2 items are still on our radar. And this is a slide you've seen in the past, and it's regarding the allocation holder of record. Item 5.2 there highlighted in yellow says an extraction allocation established under this ordinance is assigned to an extraction facility. And as we've discussed in previous meetings, if you interpret the language on the screen there, just at face value, it would seem that our allocation, because it is pumped by United in the El Rio area, would belong to United. Obviously, that's not something that sits well with PHWA member agencies. It's something that Mr. Candy, our special counsel, and I have addressed at the GMA from time to time. I'm going to come back to that issue in a minute. I'm going to move to issue 2, which is the pre-sigma base period. Now, to refresh everyone's memory, the base period is the range of years that compares everyone's usage throughout the basin, and based on your historical pumping during that period, that sets the percentage of the future pool for years to come. So there have been 2 base periods that we've been discussing. One was the T period, 2003 to 2012. We call that the temporary extraction allocation period. And then the second one, pre-sigma period, and that's from 2005 to 2014. Of these 2 periods, the T period is more advantageous to us. As you shift the clock forward 3 years, we take a haircut of about 10%. We'll see that in the next slide. And what we've seen is that we've come to the dais time and time again at the GMA meetings, and we've asked the board to consider that this period has uniquely injured PHWA, and their response to us has been that they're going to keep going with the pre-sigma period because it preserves the 60-40 split across the entire basin between ag users and M&I users. And just to kind of illustrate what that change between the T period and the pre-sigma period means for PHWA, if you notice, we're on the 3rd line down there. We're 15% of the 40%. We drop down to 13.8% when you shift the time period 3 years. Over the course of a 20-year period, we would lose 7,600 acre-feet. When you do the math, that equates to roughly 10% of our overall allocation during that time period. Notice on the other hand that you see Ventura. You may be wondering, well, they're getting a windfall out of this arrangement. They're getting 10,000 acre-feet. And it's because when you shift that clock forward, they actually were using a lot more water from 2005 to 2014 relative to us. So I just want to sum up these two issues. The allocation holder of record, we have worked with the City of Oxnard, we worked with United Water Conservation District on trying to get language to include in the ordinance. And all 3 parties, we can't seem to get all 3 parties on board on the same. Seems like we get close, we get 2 of them on board, and there seems to be a sticking point with the 3rd. That's all to say that not only have we not gotten all three members, all three agencies involved to be able to agree on language, but the GMA board has said we prefer to not include language in the ordinance at all. So I had the opportunity to speak one-on-one with a GMA board member just last Thursday to pick their brain on these two issues, and their recommendation to me personally was to try and figure out a solution outside the boundaries of the GMA ordinance, to try and reach an agreement with United and Oxnard outside the scope, rather, of the ordinance, the allocation ordinance. And so that's what Mr. Candy and I will try and focus on is, can we reach an agreement regarding this allocation holder of record, which is tied to the OH pipeline agreement, which has kind of long been discussed, outside the scope of the allocation ordinance. So that's where issue number 1 sits. Regarding issue number 2, which is the base period used to carve up the basin, we're going to focus now, we're going to take a shift in approach in moving now to crafting a variance. We have come to the GMA and shared our thoughts about how this uniquely impacts PHWA, and time again, they've essentially told us that train has left the station. Try a different story here. And what we will now try and focus on is trying to submit a variance. And what a variance does is you have to demonstrate as an agency how the base period that was selected uniquely affects you, or unusual circumstances that show that your usage was artificially low, or that it was an anomaly, and that your usage in the future is indeed going to be higher. So things like basic water conservation, for example, that would not be a basis for a variance, because that's something that will presumably have long-term impacts, meaning your future water use will also be lower. And it's not an anomaly, it's something that we as an entire region were subject to. So on any slide, I think this one is maybe the only piece of new news, and that's how we're going to go about crafting a variance. And this isn't an exhaustive list, this is just kind of a starting point as where we're headed with this variance process. And at the top of the list are Navy projects. And Director Jacobson, you and Ms. Fagan will probably have some longer discussions about this on how we can best leverage the Navy's role in the basin and use that for really the betterment of PHWA as a whole. So in essence, we're going to point to items in this variance request as to why, or provide explanation as to why our usage may have been low during this pre-SGMA base period, and why we feel usage may rebound in the future. So, like I said, at the top of that list are Navy projects, and so in the short discussions I had with Ms. Fagan, she had mentioned that there were Navy projects that were winded down during that time period, and now we're seeing some more activity on the Navy base, and we hope that that trend continues upward. That would be, in my estimation, a pretty strong argument for seeking a variance. And so we want to include that near the top of the list. Another one that we can point to, and again, these are the next three are in no particular order, is the revitalization of the harbor. So that's obviously in the Beach District service area. We saw historically the harbor itself could use in any given year nearly 400 acre feet. And nowadays we're using half that. Now, while I hope that the harbor eventually has a revitalization in the near future, and a lot of us think that it will, and it's already started to have projects go underway on Peninsula Road, we think that usage may rebound. And so that would be another item to include on a variance. This third one's a little interesting, poor water quality and how that may affect water usage during the base period. It may get slightly technical here, but when water quality is poor, we have to run membrane bypass mode, just as Mr. Villafano was describing. And so when we're in membrane bypass mode, we actually consume less water as an agency. Because if we're bypassing the membranes, we're sending all that water out to our distribution system, we don't have any brine discharge. And for that reason, because of the drought, which occurred between 2013 and 2017, there was, and more of those years are captured in the pre-SGMA base period. None of those years are really captured in the T period. And so when you include the drought in the in the base period, it affects us in the way that we have lower water quality, and so we're in membrane bypass mode. We're using less water to meet the demands of our respective agencies. And so that's something that we could potentially include in a variance. And then lastly, the housing crisis. While everybody was subject to it, everyone in the basin, we can craft an argument that the coastal communities were hit particularly hard by the housing crisis in 2008, and maybe they were slow to rebound after the housing crisis, even to this day. So again, not an exhaustive list. I just wanted to include this as an indication of maybe perhaps where we're headed with the variance request. As I mentioned before, we want to try and be first in line when we get down to submitting a variance. We're a couple months away from that variance window opening, but we want to be ready for it when it comes. Speaking of a timeline, the GMA is getting ready to adopt the ordinance on February 27th. The allocations they estimate will be presented in summer of 2019, with the GSP getting ready to be adopted or completed in the fall. This ordinance that they're adopting in February, the idea is to go effective in October, the beginning of the water year. The deadline to submit the GSP to the state is January 31st of 2020. And if you ask most people that are involved and very active in the GMA, they'll tell you that this is, even now, an aggressive timeline, even though this process started quite some time ago. So with that, staff is ready to take any questions from the board.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Alicon. Any questions from the board? Any comments?
So I have one question for you. Since the variance is a discretionary process, what would be the contingency if we don't receive the variance?
Litigation is a possibility. If we feel that the explanation you get from the GMA board is that this is not a discussion about water rights. Technically, that may be true, and I don't want to speak on behalf of our special counsel, but if you were here, he may say, by limiting our ability to extract water, you are in effect affecting our water rights. And so, in essence, these two kind of become commingled. And even though this ordinance is not meant to dictate water rights or redistribute them, it essentially is. So to answer your question, if we're not successful in a variance process, then litigation is always an option, and obviously we'll consult the board prior to doing so.
Any other questions from members? So I have a couple of questions. So with regard to the issue about the allocation holder, you're saying that the group feels like we could actually strike that whole item off to omit it? Is that what your conclusion was?
What the direction, and I shouldn't use the word direction, what the suggestion of the GMA board is that they have no interest in including it in the allocation ordinance. They do not want to take a side of any party and include that in the ordinance. They felt like if they were going to speak to one agreement in the basin, that it would kind of open a can of worms to every other agreement between various agencies in the basin. And while Mr. Candy and I kind of disagreed with that position, because I felt like they were taking a position by stating that the allocation belonged to the facility, that in itself was taking a side. There's only so long we can beat that drum. We have other issues to tackle with the GMA, namely the variance process, and before we sour that relationship entirely, we want to try and at least preserve our relationship so we can be successful at least on the variance process, if that is the case. The allocation holdout record is still a big deal that we're going to continue to keep an eye on. However, we feel that it's best addressed outside the scope of the allocation ordinance. It's best addressed outside the Board of Supervisors meeting room, and I think we can be more effective, in dealing directly with the City of Oxnard and United Water.
So does this board need to consider something else on a future agenda to get that done? Would you recommend something?
I think at this point there's more work to be done on the part of staff, and really it's hard even kind of getting the right people in the room, given that a lot of the attention is on the allocation ordinance right now. My feeling is that once the allocation ordinance, if it does happen to be adopted next week, which is the 27th, once that has passed, we'll be able to refocus our efforts on the OH pipeline agreement and the allocation holder of record discussion.
So could we then put that onto a future agenda, make that an item for discussion?
Yeah, we can definitely do that when we're, as Mr. Alicant said, there's a little bit more work that we need to do, but when that's done, we can place it on either the probably March or April agenda.
Because it seems like that would be a really valuable discussion to have. Okay,
Sure.
super. And then the other one too is that when you talked about how, going back to one of the slides, it was probably the one previous to the end one, so it was that one. Number 3, poor water quality. So you're saying that PHWA using less water because it's just pushing the water through without going through the filtration. And I happen to agree on this because I know neighbors and I bring in our own water to drink and all of that. So it does then decrease our water usage, right? And that's what
And it's
folks
substantial.
do.
Yeah. During the brine discharge is somewhere on the realm, and maybe board members or staff may have a better knowledge of this. Last I understood, is about 15 to 20% in terms of discharge. Director Bouchard, I see you nodding your head. So it sounds about right. Now, that's huge, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if we're not discharging 15 to 20%, that's water that we otherwise would have used. And we're not using that because of drought conditions. I think that's a pretty strong argument going into a variance process.
So then as we come down to the end where there could be a decision then made by the GMA on the 27th, is that what you have the date certain?
Yeah, the ordinance is going before the board, before the GMA board on the 27th. Variances will not be discussed at that meeting. The variances will be handled later in the year. Once the allocations are published, likely in the summertime, our understanding, as described by GMA staff, is that there will be about a 2 to 3 month window where agencies can see their allocation and then prepare and submit a variance. And the variance process, as it's described now, it's of course not in writing, is that it would be a decision made by the executive director of the GMA, and then it could be appealed to the full board if the agency was unhappy about the executive director's conclusion.
So then when this group reconvenes in March, you'll have a report back to us about what has happened
Yeah, and
with the ordinance.
with things of any substance, I think this will be a continuing discussion, and we'll continue to update the board as this evolves.
Okay, good.
Can I ask one question?
Yes,
Maybe it's
please,
a comment or a
Member
question.
Bouchard.
Is there written communication planning on coming from either the PHWA to the GMA board in advance of the February 27th hearing?
That's a good question. In fact, we have a meeting. It kind of hinges on a couple things that are both happening tomorrow. One of which is a meeting with Navy representation tomorrow at noon, and that's going to be followed by an M&I group discussion. These are the regular monthly discussions we've been having with the M&I group over the last few years. So out of those 2 meetings, our goal is to reach a conclusion tomorrow of whether it would be fruitful to craft something.
Okay, well, I'll just make a general comment that I would hope that there's some written communication coming. You've got some big issues that you're being asked to tackle here on behalf of the agency, and hopefully that we're putting some written communication to paper the file to preserve every opportunity you may need in order to protect the interest. So I'd just
We
make
can
that
certainly
general
do that.
comment.
We can certainly, as the presentation has shown, we have some issues that I think we can bring up, at least as a marker or placeholder or a record, that we will be bringing these to the board at a future date.
So then that would be reflected in the minutes, Mr. Counselor. Do we need to take up a motion for something official, or is just staff would take care of that?
Yeah, are you seeking a formal direction on this?
I think it would be a good idea too, and after hearing the suggestion, I think it's a great one, and I think staff will follow through on that recommendation.
Okay, so I don't guess you need a motion. I think it's just direction to staff.
Okay, direction to staff. Super. All right. Thank you very much. Oh, yes, hold on just a second.
Just one more question
Member
about
Hernandez.
your variance items. Have you considered the changes in business population? Because we're increasing the number of businesses here in Fort Hueneme. Would that have an effect in water usage at all? Could that be used as a point of leverage?
I think anything that shows that we're going to have increased water use in the future is worthy of including. And so when we get ready to craft this variance, which is right around the corner, we'll want to bring in several parties, everything from, if the city has a business development coordinator or something of that sort, we'd want to include them in that discussion.
Thank you.
Okay, all right. Thank you, Mr. Alarcon. Okay, so then we are down to number 6, proposal for facility condition assessment of the BWRDF. And you're handling that? Okay. Mr. Alarcon.
Thank you. The brackish water reclamation demonstration facility has aged over the past 25 years or 23 years since it was constructed. While there have been some upgrades to the plant, it's in need of some reinvestment. So prior to doing any sort of major reinvestment, it's a good practice to conduct what's called a facility condition assessment, FCA for short. And we have sought the services of Gannett Fleming, who you may recall the name is also doing our strategic planning exercise on behalf of the agency as well. So we asked Gannett Fleming to prepare a scope, and they came back with the attached for board consideration. Briefly, that scope is to conduct visual observation of the plant for structural, mechanical, process electrical, and instrumentation systems, and then develop a schedule of investment and prioritize those investments in that condition assessment. The idea being that with our limited capital dollars, that we can best utilize those and reinvest those into the plant. Overall, the scope is in the magnitude of $52,000. If approved, they would begin in spring of 2019, and they'd be completed with the FCA in June and available for board consideration then. So with that, if there's any questions of staff, I'll be able to take those now.
Okay, thank you. Are there any questions for staff? No? No? Okay, so with that then, is there a motion? Okay, is there a second?
I'll second.
Okay, forgot to ask if there's anyone. We don't have any speaker cards, so, all right. So motion has been made and seconded. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? None. So motion carries unanimously, so thank you, Mr. Alarcon. And with that, then we move on to the board member reports, comments, and requests for future agenda items. So with that, are there any members that want to make any comments or reports or schedule something future on the agenda for this group? All right, so seeing none, then the Port Hueneme Water Agency is adjourning to the next regular meeting scheduled for Monday, March 18th, to be held here at City Council Chambers at 4 p.m. Thank you.